Good morning, everyone. We'll start here in another minute or so. I'll give everybody time to join. Thank you for joining us, and we'll get started shortly. Good morning, everyone. I'll just give everybody 1 more minute. Try to be respectful of time, but just want to make sure we get any stragglers, and then we'll begin here. Thanks for joining us. All right. Good morning, and welcome to the August webinar for the St. Louis Metro section of the Missouri chapter of the American Planning Association. My name is Jonathan Raish, and as the Vice President for our local section, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. For those of you who track CM credits, today's webinar has been submitted for 1 CM equity credit, so please remember to log your attendance after the event is complete. And before we dig into today's topic, I wanted to provide a plug for a few upcoming events for our section. The first of that is that our section is in the process of updating our bylaws. Revisions were presented to the members at our meeting in June and we are currently in the 2-week voting period. So please see the section newsletter that you should receive via email on Fridays for information on the proposed revisions and how to vote for those bylaws. The deadline to vote will be midnight on Sunday, August 27th. The second item with this section is that we are currently accepting nominations for the 2023 section awards in 3 categories: Outstanding Award for Plan Making, Outstanding Award for Best Planning Practice, and the F. Davis Award for Outstanding Planning Advocate and Leader. Information about how to submit a nomination can also be seen in our weekly newsletter or on the section's website. The deadline for nominations is 5 p.m. on Friday, September 29th. And if you have any questions about that process, you can contact Shilpi Barty via email, and her information is listed on the section's website. The last item, upcoming event that we wanted to note today was that our next informal planner coffee chat is scheduled for Friday, September 29th at 8 a.m. and will be at the Bread Company in Richmond Heights. Bagels, fruit, and coffee will be provided by the section, and this specific session will include the book club focus on the book Happy City by Charles Montgomery. So please come share your thoughts on the book, or just come to catch up with fellow planners from our region. So with those items noted, without further ado, we'll get into our topic for today, which is a presentation on the Economic Justice Action Plan, which was commissioned by the St. Louis Development Corporation and conducted by a team of consultants, including PGAV planners. Our two speakers for today are Catherine Hamaker and Adam Stroud. Both are associate directors with PGAV. Catherine's background is in urban planning and community engagement, which she has utilized to organize various types of public outreach related to strategic planning efforts for a variety of planning and organization development projects. She enjoys bringing community members and traditional leaders together to form a consensus to strategically get communities where they want to go. She enjoys helping communities implement ideas that further a strong sense of place. Adam is passionate about the power that economic development has to create change in communities. He is an expert in data analysis and combines this with his market experience to assist all of his clients. Prior to PGAV, Adam worked as an economic developer in his hometown of Greenville, Illinois. He has implemented local economic development strategies, completed extensive public outreach, and performed market research for various communities across the Midwest. So Catherine and Adam, thank you very much for agreeing to present your this project with our group today. And so everybody knows, after the presentation, I will come back and moderate question and answer session. So please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A module through Zoom throughout the presentation, and we'll go through them at the end. And if we do run out of time, the presenters have said that you can email them questions afterward as well. So with that said, I will now hand it over to Catherine and Adam.
Right. I'm gonna give Adam some control of this as well, and then I'll get us going. Thanks, Jonathan. So what Adam and I are here to talk to you guys about today is the Economic Justice Action Plan. So this planning process began in late 2021 and then went through 2022 and was really geared towards pulling together all of the work that had been done in the past by SLDC and trying to reorient some of the work that they do towards correcting some economic injustice that happened in the city of St. Louis over the past many decades, but also reorient some of the work that they do to be more effective and efficient and really pointed towards the ends they were trying to accomplish. So to get us sort of started, I'm going to give you a little background about who SLDC is. So SLDC, or the St. Louis Economic Development Corporation, is an independent economic development agency that serves the city of St. Louis, sort of a quasi-governmental agency that works in between the city of St. Louis, citizens, developers, to encourage economic development across the city. They also function in some cooperative relationships with St. Louis County. They do all kinds of things, from incentives for development to workforce development programs. They're a pretty broad organization, but they work pretty closely with the city of St. Louis's government to try to execute projects. So we were hired by SLDC to figure out how they could reorient some of the work that they do towards economic justice. And so the Economic Justice Action Plan was really an attempt to create a strategic plan for the organization to guide their next 5 years of development. And the reason this really came about is because the previous administration had conducted a really robust planning effort, the Equitable Economic Development Framework, which gathered a ton of data and produced a lot of information to sort of give SLDC the many options for directions they could go, the many different programs that they might be able to execute. But under new leadership at SLDC, they were really looking for an action plan to guide their next step. So out of all of these options and all of these things that we could help, really, what should we start with? Where should we prioritize? And so that's really what sort of pushed them towards creating this action plan. Again, new leadership. Neil Richardson is the current president and CEO of SLDC, and he's about 2 years into that role. So previous to Neil, there was a leader who was there for a long time. And so as the changing of guard happened, Neil was really looking for some guidance about where to begin. So that also guided the need for this action plan. Also, the desire to rethink some of SLDC's priorities and actions. It's an organization that has been around for a long time. And as I mentioned, does all kinds of things. And so figuring out how to kind of prioritize what they do and make sure that those actions are really pointed towards an end that everyone is on board with was part of another driving factor for accomplishing the action plan. And then a couple of other really important pieces are the impacts of the COVID pandemic. So that impacted the city in a really dramatic way. And when Neil took over, it was also sort of as the city began looking towards recovery. And so how could SLDC help with that recovery? How could they reorient the projects that they work on and the work that they do towards assisting with that recovery? And then alongside with that was the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that came to the city of St. Louis, many of which were then oriented towards some of the work that SLDC is in charge of. And so really the moment in time of COVID-19 recovery, the ARPA dollars, new leadership, building on some of that past planning efforts provided an opportunity for SLDC to kind of really start from a clean slate to figure out what the next 5 years should look like. So we were engaged along with a project team to lead this 12-month long planning process. And so Adam and I are going to kind of walk you through what that process looked like. There's some kind of key milestones throughout. And then we have sort of focused this presentation on what we thought planners might be interested in. So there's a big geographic focus to the Economic Justice Action Plan, and that's really in order to help them prioritize deploying resources. But it's also, I think, from a planner's perspective, a really interesting way to think about the value of place-based work and the value of thinking geographically about how programs and policies might impact places. So I mentioned a little bit about this, but this is sort of the rationale of why SLDC and Neil Richardson wanted to embark on this process. He was really interested in correcting the generations of disinvestment that have happened in parts of our city. So again, that place-based aspect of this was really important. You know, things like Black households have 1/10 of the wealth of white households, that there's less home buyers, that home value is lower, that earnings is lower, you know, all of those kind of indicators of wealth. White households in St. Louis City just perform a lot better. And a lot of that has to do with generations of disinvestment. And so that's one of the sort of whys for doing this project, is thinking about how to use the dollars, the resources, the policies that SLDC has at their fingertips to begin to correct some of those things. The other piece is COVID-19. So the pandemic sort of just furthered a lot of those pieces of disinvestment that had already been occurring for generations. You know, the qualified census tracts for COVID recovery dollars are overwhelmingly non-white. They have a higher unemployment rate, a lower education rate, household incomes are lower. And so again, all of those same indicators you saw on the previous slide of how that difference between Black and white households also shows up really clearly in the qualified census tracts for recovery dollars. And so again, that just speaks to sort of the rationale behind this work, is thinking about how to correct some of these graphs to make them a little bit more even. You know, what are the ways that SLDC could deploy their resources to try to correct some of these longstanding wrongs? So how the process was structured, there's a few different phases of the work. So the first one was engagement. I'm not going to talk a ton about that because we had a sub-consultants key strategic group that led a lot of this work. It's an important part of the process, but I'm going to kind of focus on the other three. The next one was the creation of the Economic Justice Index. So this is a a map of the city that Adam's going to talk you through kind of the methodology for, but ultimately it was intended to be a guide, a geographic prioritization of the city that SLDC could use to deploy resources and really think about where you could get the most out of your work, where the areas that needed the most, where there were areas that had some existing strength, to ensure that the dollars that they were deploying and the resources, both staff and money, were going to be utilized, and actually make some of those graphs maybe turn a different way. We also did a lot of goal setting with SLDC leadership. So thinking about what are the big picture priorities for your work in the long term? How would that show up in a shorter term action plan? How do the work and the projects and the programs that you all already do kind of fall within those buckets? And then lastly, there was a big data collection effort that resulted in demonstration areas. So these are geographic areas selected to kind of demonstrate what could be if we invested in all of these places in this way, in these programs. How could that begin to change the experience on the ground for residents? So ultimately, the action plan is organized into 5 primary goals. So those big picture goals for the city, 3 pillars, which are SLDC's 3 priority areas, and then those demonstration areas that help to show kind of, if we did all of this, this would be the impacts in real life. So that first piece is engagement. As I mentioned, it was led by a local consultant, Key Strategic Group, and included a variety of things. The first one was the crosswalk of previous plans. So when this process started, a lot of people said things like, well, we just did a plan, or what about the other work? What about the last survey I filled out? And so it was really important to do this crosswalk of these previous plans. So what that looked like was looking at the community engagement and the feedback from all of those previous plans, inventorying that work to really understand, we asked you this before, what did you say? What's consistent across plans? What's different across plans? How do groups differ in their opinion of some of these next steps? And that really then guided that other engagement, the interviews, the focus groups, the broader public engagement, the survey, so that we could ask, this is what you said last time. Did we hear that right? Or we didn't hear a lot about this thing. What do you think about this? Or is this still important to you? And so I think that doing that crosswalk of previous plans first really helped to guide the rest of that engagement. I'm going to turn it to Adam now to talk about that next piece. No. You're muted, Adam.
Here we go. Sorry about that. And I exited out of your slideshow.
I'll do it.
I'm going to restart that.
There you go. You're good.
Perfect. Thank you. So the concept behind the Economic Justice Index is that the disinvestment that occurred in St. Louis over decades was largely along racial lines. And the way our city's been built and how it's been populated, those racial lines are unfortunately, they also tell you what the geographic boundaries of that disinvestment is. So where you live tells you a lot about you, unfortunately, right? We all know that as urban planners and economic developers. That is an unfortunate truth to our system. And so seeing as the injustice and disinvestment was done geographically, we felt that, and along with SLDC, that the solution also had to follow a geographic solution. So this is an art that is sort of followed by a science. You can create an index that says whatever you want. Obviously you have to include the underlying data, but ultimately you are the mixologist. You're figuring out what all of these different factors, which ones are important to you, and connect that with what you are trying to accomplish. And what you end up with is a map that might look something like this, or something that's related to the geography that you're studying, whether it be a neighborhood, a county, or a municipality. For this, the Economic Justice Index, we provided 2 main categories of factors. On the one hand, We looked at indicators of need. We looked back to the old redlining maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation from the early 20th century. And we looked at things like, does the area have a high number of unoccupied lots? And we're assuming that these things are proxies for disinvestment and proxies for injustice that was done. Fast forward to today, you've got high unemployment rate. Since the disinvestment was largely drawn along geographic and racial lines, we were very explicit in saying that one of the factors basically is just, are the residents predominantly Black? St. Louis is a very Black and white city. This, speaking from my soapbox here, but it's a very Black and white city. And so we felt that the map really needed to reflect that fact. We also compared it. We also included indicators of opportunity. So is there a community development corporation currently? Are there opportunity sites? Those opportunity sites were pulled from the Equitable Economic Development Framework study that was done a few years ago. So we're incorporating things like that to say that, yes, there's need, but there's also opportunity because there are existing organizations that could take potentially some of the ARPA funding and some of the incentives that SLDC offers, and they could put it to good use. So we didn't want to pick areas that didn't have any need at all. We also didn't want to pick areas that didn't have any opportunities at all. We know that, the ARPA money sounds like a lot of money, but once you start distributing it, it really doesn't go very far. Some of these areas really have a lot of work to be done. And we felt, along with SLDC and the rest of our consulting team, that the investment really needed to be focused to really get a good return on investment, not only for the city, but a return on investment for those neighborhoods that have a lot of need. So in the index, and I'll go through how you create an index, basically. There won't be any math. I'll just talk about sort of the basic concepts behind creating an index and why you might do it. But in ours, it combined all of these factors, and we arrived at 5 different categories. EJI, or Economic Justice Index 1 through 5. Those categories are not meant to say that the faucet is completely turned off for EJI 5. That's not what it means. It just means that EJI 5 might have different needs than EJI 1. EJI 1, you're talking about areas that were redlined and that have currently high unemployment rates. And there's a lot more work to be done there. But EJI 5, there are residents in these areas and businesses in these areas that still could use help from SLDC and the ARPA funding. It just might look a little bit different. So in EJI 5 areas, we still want residents to be able to afford to live there. So the work that needs to be done might look a little bit more like affordable housing, or sort of fighting off some negative impacts of gentrification and economic development. You want the economic development, but you want it to go well for the people that live there right now. So that's how each area is treated a little bit differently, but none of them should be forgotten, and that is not the intent of the Economic Justice Index. There we go. Okay, so how do you create an index? I'm going to try and make this as relevant to anybody's situation as I can, because I think this is a tool that's very useful in decision making. It's not meant to be a yes or no. It's meant to be a prioritization tool and to help you understand where your opportunities and need lie. So this illustration to the left really shows that the cube is the city of St. Louis, right? And when we create an index, we create what's called a mosaic. A mosaic is it's just a collection of separate images, or pixels, if you will. And so we're assigning a value to each pixel. And once we stack all those layers, it's pixels on top of pixels that have information containing the unemployment rate, the percentage of vacant lots, was the area redlined or not, and is there a CDC present, things like that. What you end up in the end is at the top, you end up with this number that on its own doesn't mean anything to anybody, right? An index is simply that. It's a number made up of facts that tell you basically the difference between one pixel to the next. That's the most important part. And so when you're talking about a mosaic or pixels in terms of a city, it might be a block group, census block group. It might be an individual parcel, or it might be something like a neighborhood. The size of the geography is really up to you, and it needs to be thought through so that your geographies aren't too big or too small, right? This is, like I said, it's an art and not just a science. So if your data is really granular to the parcel level and that size, then your cells and your pixels should probably reflect that. So once you add them all up through a process that I won't get into in terms of what buttons you click in the ArcGIS software, what you end up with is this mosaic of different images. And then it's up to you to color code the map based on those values. So what you end up with, if we did all these factors over the city of St. Louis, what you end up with is something like this. All right. And then as a policy maker and a decision maker, you can use this to your advantage to determine where you might allocate resources, both from there's monetary resources and incentives, but there's also your staff time that you might consider. I wanted to go through, these images are a little grainy, sorry. This is from a project a few years ago that we did in Kansas City, where we wanted to look at the 3 different types of shapes in the ArcGIS software. You've got points, which might be building permits or infrastructure projects. You've got the lines, which would say that we've invested in this underground infrastructure from Main Street to 2nd Street, or it might be the construction of a road or something like that. And then you've got the parcels or the polygons. Those are your property where you can track property value from year to year. And so what we did as a part of that process was we're looking at how to combine things from different formats, these points and lines and polygons, into one category. All right. And that's really what the index is supposed to be. It's supposed to take data from various formats and put them and boil them down into one number. Here's an example that we used for a project. We've done some planning with the Tabernacle CDC in North City around Fairground Park. And this was really important because, again, even though it's a smaller geography than the entire city, it's still a large neighborhood, right? And there's a lot to be done. So it was important for us to help this client prioritize where the investments needed to be made and what types of investments needed to be made. So in this example, the mosaic was made up of the condition of individual structures, where the community assets were, so schools, post office, hospital, medical, stuff like that, and things like property ownership. What's towards the bottom, you've got the metro bus access, which is very important for a lot of the city. So that was something that we wanted to consider and bake into this mosaic. So here's what you were left with. At the end, and I should back up, these priorities were all done through engagement with the client and their stakeholders. So again, it's an art, right? You're figuring out what your priorities are and what you might want to bake into the index. And then that leads you to the finished product, which is a map that's representative of your priorities and where you might start the work, basically. Where are the highest priority areas? Again, it's not that you're only going to invest in the dark maroon color, and then you're never going to even look at the pale yellow. But it just means that as opportunities come up, this is supposed to help you make decisions that are efficient and follow your priorities. It also, I think, what an index does, it also signals to the residents of the area, and it also signals to the private real estate development community that this is where we are prioritizing development in the city. It doesn't mean that your neighborhood is going to be completely forgotten. It just means that the investment might look a little bit different. And, you know, I suppose there is sort of a tough love element to any sort of index like this. You know, it is true that if you're in EGI 5, SLDC might spend a little less time trying to develop the area, or the help might look a little bit different. Again, it's going back to an equitable way to develop the area. If we were going for equality, there would be no need for a map. You would just say, well, we're going to treat everybody in every neighborhood the same. And that's the equal approach. What SLDC and the administration wanted to do was go towards the equitable approach, which means that we're not going to just start from scratch. We're not going to start from everybody has the same opportunity. We are going to help out some neighborhoods a little bit more because they were disinvested for so long, and it wouldn't be fair just to treat them the same as everybody else. So that's kind of the equity versus equality portion of this. Is it fair? I guess it depends on your perspective, but that's how SLDC was thinking about it, and that's how we created our index. Catherine?
Great. Thanks, Adam. So in addition to the index, which was a very concrete process that we worked with SLDC leadership to kind of think through priorities and think through what that map and the results of the index could look like, we also worked with them around these big picture goals. So you can see here these 5 primary goals. These were Neil thinking long-term, if SLDC does all the work that they could and should do, what would be those big picture goals? And so it's strengthen neighborhoods, close the wealth gap, improve health and educational outcomes, expand the tax base, and grow the city's population. So those 5 primary goals were really what guided the rest of our work. You can see how they show up in the index, but then you can also see how they show up in the rest of the plan. They're sort of the guiding principles, I would say, for SLDC's work and for the Economic Justice Action Plan. So kind of underneath those 5 primary goals are these 3 pillars. These are sort of the 3 focus areas for SLDC's work. 3 strategic pillars, as they refer to them. So it's economic empowerment, equitable and inclusive development, and neighborhood transformation. And so these 3 sort of buckets of work encompass a lot of the stuff that SLDC already does, but also provide sort of a framework for the establishment of new programs and new ways to deploy money, knowing that if things fit in these 3 pillars, they would then lead back to these 5 primary goals. So again, the 3 pillars, the equitable and inclusive development, really includes leveraging real estate and business retention, expansion, attraction to catalyze that equitable and inclusive economic growth that SLDC really desires. Neighborhood transformation is about leveraging community assets to transform those historically disinvested neighborhoods, and then again, build that wealth and the wealth building opportunities for residents. And then economic empowerment includes a lot of the small business development, workforce development, jobs, mentorship, that kind of work that SLDC has been doing. And again, these 3 pillars represent a lot of what SLDC does. It represents a lot of the powers that they already hold in terms of programs and resources, but also provides that framework for thinking about, okay, if we want to deploy a new program or if we want to hire new staff, kind of where does that fit in terms of our 3 strategic pillars? So you can see in this graphic here, kind of a big picture view of how they saw the 3 pillars of investment really spending a lot of this ARPA money and resulting in a pretty significant investment in the city. So Empower is, again, the business empowerment, the workforce development, the educational justice piece, which had a significant ARPA commitment initially, and then additional money allocated to result in $61 million for economic empowerment. Equitable and inclusive development was really about incentive reform, site assembly, that commercial corridor revitalization you've heard a lot about in the news. That's $27 million of the initial commitment, in addition to a phase 2 commitment. And then lastly, that neighborhood transformation. And so this is capacity building in neighborhoods, vacancy work, environmental justice, all the housing programs, that all fits in that neighborhood transformation bucket. And again, comes to about $250 million before 2026. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these pillars to kind of think through how those big numbers and some of this shows up in the actual plan. So again, economic empowerment is investing in an ecosystem that provides opportunities for businesses to launch, grow, and sustain their operations, and then creating those workforce development opportunities through mentorship, training, and quality jobs. So this pillar is really about businesses and workforce. And so the programs that SLDC already has, again, thinking about new programs, new investments would fit in this pillar. And so a lot of our work was sort of sorting through the programs that SLDC already operates and thinking about how they fit in terms of strategic actions underneath each pillar, and then ultimately what outcomes and impact those could have. And so there were a series of actions under each of these red headings. So a series of actions under small business empowerment and support, under workforce development, and under expanding education. And then what you see here on the screen were the outcomes and impact. And so it was really important for us to provide SLDC not only with these pillars and then the actions to take, but also the outcomes and the impact that they could sort of track back and say, okay, did that work? Did this program result in 100 individuals at the Economic Empowerment Center per year? I'm sorry, 1,000 individuals at the Economic Empowerment Center per year? Did it result in 30 workshops or 500 city residents getting connected to new training and job skill opportunities? And so for each of these pillars, there are a series of actions and then a series of outcomes, so that each year SLDC in their annual report could look back and say, did we accomplish these tasks? Some of these tasks are already accomplished in 2023. We're about 3/4 through the year. And so it'll be interesting to see at the end of the year how many of these things SLDC was able to accomplish. Some of them are easier than others, I'll say. 30 workshops at the Economic Empowerment Center is a lot easier than reusing at least 2 unoccupied schools as new community resources. But something to kind of guide the work of everyday SLDC employees, but then also guide the overall vision for each year. If they get to the end of the year and some of these outcomes or impacts haven't occurred, could we pivot some of our resources? Could we alter the programs? Could we add another staff person here or there to try to accomplish some of these things that we said were important? We put them in the action plan because they were important next steps for SLDC. But if they're not getting to that outcome or the impact that we want, what's the way we could kind of pivot that work? So similarly, we went through the same exercise for neighborhood transformation. So again, this is about leveraging community assets to transform physical, social, and economic aspects of those historically disinvested neighborhoods that Adam talked about with the index, to build capacity and wealth building. And so this is a lot of work related to CDCs and residents in neighborhoods and physical spaces, neighborhood planning. All of that stuff fits in this bucket. Again, outcomes and impact here. So neighborhood capacity building, thinking about the neighborhood managers. Neighborhood managers are something that SLDC has recently deployed. That role was really geared towards creating that connection between SLDC and neighborhood residents, so that some of these resources that already exist could really find those residents that need them. Figuring out how to support CDCs in some sort of formal, concrete way so that they have the capacity to execute on some of the important work that they are already doing. Things related to occupancy and environmental justice. This is really related to LRA and figuring out what to do with the vacancy problem in key areas of the city. And then housing accessibility. So a lot of housing programs, housing repair programs, home down payment assistant programs, all of those things that the city already operates, how can those programs be leveraged to get at some of these outcomes that will have those long-term impacts in those areas of disinvestment? And then the last one being equitable and inclusive development. So this one is really about real estate development. It's about figuring out how business retention and expansion, and then attracting those new businesses to the city of St. Louis can help economic growth. So again, it all tracks back to those 5 big picture goals: increasing the tax base. All of those things fit under this umbrella. And then outcomes and impact here, as you'll see, are really more real estate oriented. And so utilizing incentives to facilitate 10 new commercial or industrial developments in EJI 1 or EJI 2. So that's an example of where the Economic Justice Index, that place-based strategy for prioritization, then shows up really clearly in the action plan. So in the steps that SLDC would take, staff members using capacity and resources to make a really specific intentional effort to try to sort of change that map. So if we did that Economic Justice Index activity again in 10 years, it would start to look different. Those areas that are really yellow would maybe be green or even blue. And so some of these goals are really concretely tied to that index. Others are tied to improving processes that SLDC already has, or trying to shift some of their work. And so, deploying a new incentive scorecard is a piece that falls here. SLDC has already begun doing that. That utilizes the Economic Justice Index as well. Thinking about how some of the sites that might be used for more community-focused commercial development could come to be, assembling underutilized industrial parcels so that we could encourage more workforce development and more jobs. So you can see that these really span a pretty wide variety of outcomes and then resulting impacts, but really go back to that index and that geographic place-based focus of trying to get the work that SLDC does oriented in a way that's going to correct that long-term disinvestment, then also provide opportunities for residents and businesses. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's one more page of outcomes and impacts about this one. So commercial corridor revitalization. That's another one. I'm sure you've heard about it in the news. It's one of the programs that SLDC has deployed in partnership with the city pretty significantly. So they've invested a lot of dollars in trying to revitalize commercial corridors in key geographic areas. And so you'll see that those geographic areas directly align with the Economic Justice Index. And the intention is to really do things like reduce vacancy and support access to affordable housing and connect to existing street improvements and support Metrolink expansion and some of those big picture priorities that through targeted investment of resources and staff capacity, SLDC could begin to make some of those impacts. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Adam, who's going to talk a little bit more about the demonstration area piece.
Okay, so this map should look familiar. It's the Economic Justice Index again. And what we worked with SLDC and the rest of the consulting team on is finding demonstration areas that aren't necessarily obligations or guarantees that all the ARPA money will be spent here or anything like that. It's mostly to say that these areas are in certain Economic Justice Index categories. These are the areas that we see some opportunity coming up. And if we were to implement the Economic Justice Action Plan, or at least part of it, and spend some of the money in these demonstration areas, what might it look like? I think this is an important part of the plan, because it's like okay, well, so what? Why would I invest that money? Why would I do all this? What is it going to look like, and what is it going to accomplish, basically? So what we did was we took the 3 pillars and we applied one of the pillars per demonstration area, with the exception of equitable and inclusive development. We applied to both the MLK corridor and an area that it doesn't take up all of Walnut Park, the neighborhoods that make up Walnut Park, but just a portion of it. So the one that I wanted to cover today is the MLK corridor. There we go. Okay, we had to collect some data first in order to get our baseline numbers for the area. We utilized the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative Interactive Map to figure out where the vacant buildings are, whether they're owned by LRA or the city in some other capacity, or whether they're privately owned. The St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative Interactive Map is awesome. If you haven't checked it out, please do. They've put in a lot of great work, and I think it's a really wonderful resource for public policy and for private real estate development, frankly, if you're looking to invest in an area. So we had to figure out where those vacant buildings are. We took data from the census for as far as population, jobs, what is the median income in an area. We looked at home values. We estimated what a construction cost would be on average for a home in this area, which is part of the challenge, right? If you build a home in the MLK corridor and you build that same house in, say, my neighborhood, Southwest Gardens, it's probably going to cost you the same. And the unfortunate thing is, once it's finished, it's going to be worth a lot less. And so that was important for us to have a baseline home value in those demonstration areas, where if we're going to be making all of these investments, how might that home value grow over time, and that financial gap that philanthropic, private, and public dollars go to fill, how might that gap shrink over time as property values improve? We utilize the strategic land use map of the city of St. Louis. So that's currently being worked on probably for the next year or two. Might see a lot of changes to that map, but we use the one that was on the books at the time. So when we're theoretically building out the MLK corridor, we're following the strategic land use map. So the residential areas would become homes once again, and the commercial portions would become businesses and industrial and so forth. We utilized the sort of bread and butter local government economic development tools, such as tax increment financing, community improvement districts. We did not utilize tax abatement. The goal here was to generate funding for these areas, and not just to say, okay, we're not going to pay taxes here for a while. Of course, that would be an option for these areas as well. Tax abatement is certainly at SLDC's disposal to apply to projects in these demonstration areas. And then basically once SLDC has filled the gap, or philanthropic dollars have filled the gap, hopefully there are financial institutions as well as investor equity that sort of fill the rest of that capital stack. So we had to consider all these things, and this is only 6 bullet points, but there's a lot that went into the demonstration areas, both to establish that baseline as well as tell the story of how it might build out over time. So in terms of the MLK corridor, it's going to take a lot, right? There's a lot of work to be done. It's also a very big geographic area, so take that into consideration as well. And it won't all build out at the same time, right? You're going to have, hopefully, you'll have nodes of development that are assisted and will generate additional interest in the private marketplace. And even towards the end of our investment period, which was 20 years, there still probably would be a financial gap if you're considering the difference in property value versus construction cost. The other concept behind utilizing a thing like TIF and community improvement district over tax abatement is that since there is money right now through ARPA, perhaps other funding sources that may come about in the next few years, since there is money right now, if you spend it in an area like a TIF area or a community improvement district, it at least allows the possibility that that money could live on, right? And what I mean by that is normally you've got tools like TIF and Community Improvement District where you're basically foregoing future revenue to fund something right now. And so in the future, you don't have any revenue in the TIF or you don't have any revenue in the Community Improvement District because you have already promised it to hopefully very important projects, whether they be public or private. But if you're investing ARPA dollars or some other grant, federal transportation money, something like that, if you invest that money into the TIF and the CID and you don't have to promise as much of the future revenue as you might otherwise have to, it starts to be this regenerative cycle of private investment, property tax production, sales tax production, and then those future funds can be used rather because they weren't all promised away. They can be used for public and private projects in that area. So, and that's what I mean by the ARPA money can live on. It's kind of a corny phrasing, but that's really what we're talking about here. So in years 1 through 5, maybe even 10, you're leaning heavily on some of those philanthropic and ARPA type dollars. But by years 15 and 20, your program is almost entirely funded by some of these other tools because you've made that upfront investment. The concept here also would be to track affordability. I've been in some public meetings, and there is nothing more humbling than to stand up in front of people and for you to say that we are going to invest in your neighborhood. And then for somebody to stand up and say, well, I don't want that because you're going to price me out of my home. I've worked hard all my life and now I'm retired and I have a fixed income and you want to improve my property value, which in turn would increase property taxes. So the reason we kept track of or tried to predict how taxes might rise and rents might rise as you invest in a neighborhood, the concept behind that was to just keep in mind that that is a very important topic, right? And we want to avoid displacement wherever we can, and for some of these future dollars to be spent on keeping people in their home, and hopefully for them to participate in the economic growth that is occurring around them, rather than saying, well, good luck, you're on your own. That really is not the goal of this strategy. So what you've got here is in year 1, you've got 15.3 million. These are all estimates, of course, educated guesses. 15.3 million in investments that happen. Ultimately in year 20, if we developed 50% of the MLK corridor, which is essentially MLK plus 2 blocks on either side, that's a huge area. If you look at the map, and we've only gone 2 blocks on either side, it could be something like $400 million in investment in today's dollars. So not all of that from the city. We would expect that private equity would perform some of that, the homeowners' equity themselves, as well as hopefully some philanthropic sources that are in alignment with SLDC's strategy.
Yeah, here, I just want to throw something in there, Adam.
Yeah.
One thing that's important to think about with that kind of list of investments is SLDC also following those other pieces of the action plan around down payment assistance programs or property tax support programs, home repair programs, the neighborhood managers, some of those facade improvement programs, things that can help commercial businesses and small business development. So all of those programs and staff capacity and resources are also executed at the same time so that some of those impacts or maybe negative effects of some of this, positive investment does help to kind of balance out those impacts for the residents that still live there, for the people that want to own businesses. So while these are sort of physical, concrete investments, they assume that all those programmatic and staff investments by SLDC are also taking place at the same time to really create that robust, well-rounded, comprehensive view of the neighborhood, not just the real estate piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's a lot for any one entity to accomplish. And I don't know if there were any actions that were in this presentation that related to the CDCs and local capacity building, but that's a part of this as well. It's sort of the traditional reason for intervention to begin with, right? It's to correct some sort of market failure and accomplish something there that the private marketplace is not going to. But that's not to say that they're trying to do it without the private marketplace or without local capacity. That is an absolutely key component to this being a successful 20 years, basically. All right. And SLDC, CDA have already announced investments in local CDC capacity building to help sort of extend the reach of SLDC in the city into the neighborhood, and create a lot of that grassroots momentum that may be missing at this point. Okay, so then here's some of the outcomes. Probably should have had the before numbers in here too, but in terms of residents, I think right now in the MLK corridor, at least how we've defined it, there's, I think, roughly 3,000 residents, right? So we're adding 2,900 residents to the area, which, if you think about it, it doesn't sound like a lot, but those are hopefully permanent residents. Maybe people are choosing to come back to the city rather than leaving these areas. And so that's the same principle for all these numbers, really. You've got additional sales taxes being generated, earnings and payroll taxes being generated, and taxable sales. And this is the math and behind this. But, what we don't have on this slide are the qualitative and equitable measures that hopefully will be accomplished by all this investment too, right? It's one thing for the city to say, well, this area isn't producing in as much tax revenue as we would like. Okay, that's a pretty short-sighted. It's important, but it's a pretty short-sighted goal to set. What really the goal is to expand the tax base, right? That is part of it, but also to get back to the whole reason for this in the first place, is to perform economic justice and to start to close that racial wealth gap. And hopefully the whole city will be more successful in the end for having done so. Okay.
Well, thank you, Catherine and Adam, for such an informative presentation. And I hope the attendees would have learned about the important planning tools and process involved in developing an economic justice action plan. And I do see we have some Q&A questions. And for that, I will hand Jonathan.
Thank you, Shilpi, and thank you very much, Catherine and Adam. So before I go, we do have a few questions submitted already, so we'll get into those, but I forgot to do a couple event announcements, and I'll stall and give some people to submit some more questions while we're doing that. So I mentioned our local section events coming up in the next month or two, but should have also mentioned a couple state events. So hopefully everybody is seen, but the state conference, the APA State Conference, will be October 11th through 13th at the Westin Kansas City at Crown Center. Early bird registration has opened for that. The early bird deadline is September 1st, with the hotel block closing on September 20th. More information about that is on the state chapter's website. And then like the section awards I mentioned earlier, the state is also doing their annual awards with submission deadline that's approaching very quickly of August 29th. So just wanted to mention those to everybody while we had a good group gathered here and maybe give people some extra time. So, all right, we do have a number of questions here, and I will just go through them in order that we've received them. So, okay. The first one is, how does the EJI categorization, which is well presented, differ from or less controversial than what has become known as the Team 4 plan of 1975?
Very good question. So I haven't read the Team 4 plan, but I'm just generally familiar with at least how it's been perceived, which I know isn't always fact, but I think it's what we're saying in the index is maybe the opposite of the Team 4 plan, right? So I think whether it's controversial or not, Well, I think we can just say that it is, that our index is controversial. And it depends on what side of in some cases, what side of the street, literally, you are on, whether you think that it's a good idea or a bad idea. So, Bob, I think it is controversial, and it's kind of hey, let's do something different now, which was the goal back then as well with the Team 4 plan. It's just that now we're trying something kind of, I guess you could say the opposite. Maybe not. That's not a perfect comparison, but maybe the opposite of what they were recommending. Catherine, do you have anything to add to that one?
I mean, I think we had some controversial conversations during the planning process with folks that say represented areas that were designated as EJI 3, 4, or 5. And they were concerned, does this mean SLDC is not going to do anything for us? And I think, on one hand, it is a little bit of a hard pill to swallow where we had to say, like, yeah, you're not in the priority areas. However, I do think there was a lot of good conversation around what resources would be deployed in those areas. And so I think there are a lot of small business development programs, for example, that SLDC is really targeting towards areas where there are really prosperous commercial corridors, because it's a place that small businesses can find success. And so it's a place where, if you're in EJI 5, you're still going to receive those resources from SLDC. And so it's a little bit of a messaging thing, but it's SLDC's job to make sure that they are deploying resources where they are needed. And so the resources that are needed in some of those geographic areas are just different. And so I do think it's a bit controversial, as Adam mentioned, and I think it's a messaging thing that SLDC just needs to make sure that their resources are getting to where they need, and that's going to vary by geography.
Great, thank you both. All right, this one's, I think, more of a comment, but if you all want to maybe respond. So it's not hard to draw a line from the neighborhood EJI categories to more prosperous neighborhoods wanting to create CIDs, et cetera, to pay for their own policing. More affluent neighborhoods could feel excluded from city investment. I'm not agreeing with that, but it looks like something of a correlation. You guys have any comments on that?
I think it definitely is. I think there's, that's one of the things, a couple of questions look like they address this sort of thing, but there's a lot of data indicators that are sort of proxies for other pieces of data. And so that's one of the kind of pieces of the art that is creating this matrix to result in this index, is that we can't use too many of the same ones. We can't necessarily use African-American residents and places where they were redlined and educational performance and where jobs are, and because they begin to tell the exact same story, because unfortunately a lot of those data points are tied together. And in the same way, the opposite things. So the more affluent neighborhoods, and if we included crime rates, and if we included educational outcomes and all of those things, they begin to just say the same thing. And so that was a big part of this process, is working with SLDC to decide which of the indicators are the most important and which ones are simply a proxy for the ones that matter. And so I do think that a lot of the indicators on the other side, like you're mentioning, Bob, would tell the same story. It's just they would tell that opposite side.
Mm-hmm. I think parallel to our process, consultant Baker Tilly was also coming up with a scorecard to help SLDC. I think main reason was to communicate in a transparent way how things like tax abatement might be used. There's this pot of money that's ARPA right now. And so if you're doing it in an equitable sort of way, then you're allocating more of the ARPA dollars to certain geographies. But that's not to say that those bread and butter tools like the TIF and tax abatement, those are still available to, citywide, basically. And the thought behind the scorecard was to say that if you meet enough of these, what SLDC's terming the community benefits, then you still will have access to these incentives. And so I think that's an important thing to note as well. We had a lot of conversations. You know, our office is in downtown. I'm in downtown right now. It's an extremely important part of our region and our city, and it has struggled some in recent years through COVID and other market factors as well. The scorecard doesn't say that downtown doesn't get any incentives. It does not say that, you know, and I think that's an important thing to note. It is saying that part of downtown's struggles might relate to the city overall. And so we should probably invest in a lot of the city and continue to invest in areas like downtown, Central Corridor, parts of South City, to help the city grow in a positive direction.
Thank you for those responses. All right, so next one, we've got a few more coming in. So yeah, feel free, everybody, remember, feel free to submit more questions as we go along here. We are hitting about the 1 hour mark from when the webinar started, but we try to allow these to go for a little while, to book till usually an hour and a half for these, but feel free to keep asking and we'll keep this going as long as we can. So next one is, did your work determine where/how new residents and business operators could come from? Is this a build it and they will come philosophy, or are there strategies for attracting residents and businesses?
I think part of any plan like this is a build it and they will come. There's a factor that is build it and they will come. However, we have not been building it and they have not been coming and they've been leaving, you know, so there's that component to it that has been occurring over the last half a century really, since St. Louis had its peak population back in the 40s or 50s or something like that. So St. Louis as a region, we just sort of shuffle around people. There's not a lot of net growth in our region. We're again, it is really shuffling around people. And that has been to the detriment of St. Louis City and I think some other parts of our region as well, including on the Illinois side. People have been moving around, and those that are left in those communities that have been emptied out have suffered because of it. So I think if we can grow, so the idea behind this is we'll grow the city. Hopefully there will be new people coming to our region, but I think it might be the case that some people move from other municipalities to the city. But the thinking there is, you know, if we're growing the city and we're improving the city, the region will improve and hopefully we will be more attractive to people coming in from outside of our region. But yeah, it's a little bit of both. Build it and they will come, because we haven't been building it. And then also hopefully we do improve the region to have people come in from elsewhere. I don't think it's all a zero-sum game. I'm not suggesting that's what you were getting at, Bob, but that's definitely was on my mind, was where are these people going to come from? Yeah. Catherine.
And we talked a lot through the process with SLDC around, you know, what incentives could be deployed either by SLDC or other community partners to get people to move to the city, whether it's, you know, a tax credit like some cities are considering, you know, a pure dollar handout like other cities have done. Same thing for businesses. You know, what are the ways that businesses could be incentivized to move into the city? And so there's a lot of policy pieces like that in the Economic Justice Action Plan that help to support some of these kind of models and outcomes that Adam talked through the financials of. Because I do think that's the big question, is like, if we deploy all of these resources and if we build all of these things, will it really bring back the residents and the businesses that then would be needed to support this stuff? And so it's a little bit, you know, no city has figured it out. It's a little bit of a chicken egg thing. However, we tried to kind of make moves on both of those sides to make sure that it isn't too much of one approach versus the other.
Great. All right, this next one, I'm gonna read it all. There's a lot to it, and there's a question. I'll try to circle back and remind the question, but everybody. All right, so it says redlining is an ongoing process for underappraising Black neighborhoods. It is systemic practice that devalues properties based on racist myths about risk in Black neighborhoods. Why not change the appraisal process to close the wealth gap and stop the value decline? Otherwise, all of the new investment will still be subject to devaluation in the future and not sustainable. Underinvestment leads to weak real estate markets where all of the stakeholders are reluctant to invest in the future of the area. With Action, a not-for-profit advocacy organization, is working on reforming the appraisal process to stop devaluations in Black communities, and an assurance program to increase confidence in the neighborhood's future and therefore increase investment and property values. So going back, why not change the appraisal process to close the wealth gap and stop the value decline?
Excellent point. And I think SLDC supports, we've had conversations about the appraisal gap as a part of this planning process. And I think I can speak for SLDC to say that they support something like that. Now it's a banking issue. Not to say that it's not the city's problem, right? Like the city should ignore something like that. But I think they can support it to the extent they can. And I agree that is a horrible, there goes my light. There we go. That illustration earlier that I gave of if you build the same home in two different neighborhoods and it's worth a third or less in one neighborhood than the next, that's a wealth gap issue and it needs to be addressed. And part of that is working with the banks, I guess, to try and change that system and how that plays out. But that's a very long process. It took us a long time to get here. And I think it's going to be a long process to correct some of those wrongs. But a very good point, Rosalind.
All right. Next one is, are educational opportunities and mental health considered as indicators of need?
Not specifically, no. However, like Catherine said earlier, unfortunately, some of those factors are proxies for other things as far as racial and geographic discrimination. So this is SLDC's action plan. And so we're trying to take into account what can SLDC accomplish with their mission and their charge when they were created as an economic development nonprofit. The hope is that by SLDC doing their best and by the city investing in these things, that these other factors would improve as well, even though they don't maybe have a direct role to play in a school system or a health system.
I think that leads into the next one pretty well, Adam. So it's what discussions happened or need to happen with city agencies and other influences outside of SLDC to correct the systems that cause inequitable economic conditions, such as predatory lending, real estate comps, i.e. the new red lines, the morass of getting a business license, homelessness, evictions. So anything more any more light on what conversations happened during your process about discussions that did happen or need to happen with those other groups?
Yeah, it comes from the Equitable Economic Development Framework. There were numerous partnerships pointed out and folks that might work together. I think it's probably the case in most communities that those discussions are not happening enough, right? People aren't working together enough, but people only have so much capacity to fill the day with meetings and that sort of stuff. So I think from what I heard during those discussions is that SLDC is doing their absolute best to connect the dots and form those partnerships. And yeah, sure, not just to pick on SLDC, but cities all over can do a better job of those sorts of partnerships.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of specific conversations through this process where we would meet with a specific city department or a specific city employee, and it would be discovered that turns out they had this data source or they operate this program that, could help some people that SLDC are seeing during the day when they come into the Economic Empowerment Center or, whatever it might be. So I think St. Louis certainly struggles with coordinating those systems. We're not unique in that way, but we're having a harder time in some cities to coordinate that process. And I think that became very apparent during the process, that a lot of our systems are, outdated and siloed, and figuring out how SLDC could try to coordinate some of those was a big piece of this action plan. Now, it's not all in SLDC's control. And so a lot of it does have to do with other city departments or other agencies or other, banks or other sort of institutions coming to the table and really working with SLDC to execute some of these system level changes. And I think through the process, it became super clear that SLDC can only do so much. So if those other groups aren't willing to come to the table, then we've got to do what's in SLDC's control. And so again, if the system of appraisal gaps, for example, is going to persist and it's not something that SLDC can independently turn the ship on, what can they do? What is in their control to begin to make some steps towards closing that gap, for example? So I don't think the action plan can solve all by any means, but I do think the exercise of going through the action plan and the exercise of SLDC trying to reorient some of the work that they do can help to try to coordinate better some of those systems and some of those programs that already exist.
Great, thank you both. All right, next question is, there have been some reports that at least some of the city's population loss can be attributed to families. Can you share how this plan supports families and the school district to retain population?
Yeah. So I think SLDC, most of their charge is to deal with real estate, whether that be housing or industry or office buildings, something like that, right? That's what they're in charge of, I guess, for the city, the economic development through real estate. And so I think the connection would be that our school district funding has a lot to do with property taxes, right? And that's just how our system works. It's the same way in Illinois. It's the same way in many parts of our country, and sure, there is state aid that tries to make up for that, but oftentimes it's not enough. So I think to the extent SLDC can encourage real estate development and economic development, that hopefully can produce and result in greater funding opportunities and hopefully safer neighborhoods, which could result in safer schools, better schools. It's that sort of waterfall effect. Now that's a big dream, right? And it's easier said than done. But I do think that is the connection between SLDC and SLPS.
And there's some super specific next steps in the plan for LRA, for example, ways to get more LRA property back in the hands of private owners, ways to improve the way that SLDC holds property, how they advertise property, how they structure LRA internally. Those sort of pieces are in the plan. And while that is a sort of a long line, a multi-step connection to getting more kids to go to the St. Louis public school system, it is also the first step. If we can get some of that LRA property back into the hands of private owners so that it can be developed, so that families can move in and then be in the school district, that's as I said, it's a long line connection, but I do think, that's one place where if some strategic investment and policy choices were made, that would be one way to encourage that real estate development and therefore grow the population.
Great. All right, moving on. So it says, I really like the link of outcomes and impacts to the index. Did you find any gaps in data collection that you recommended to SLDC to start collecting or to refine collecting to really use this tool?
Yeah, I'll start with this one, Catherine. So, it's an interesting exercise and sometimes frustrating with the city and the sort of the bureaucratic structure of the city being so large and with so many different departments and so many different data sources. It's a really big task to connect all the dots and to get SLDC access to data that the Department of Revenue or the collector of revenue might have, or the license collector. It's easier said than done. Yes, it should happen. And I think in a lot of instances it does happen already. But it's a very big task, right? when the license collector is taking in payments and information about business licenses, they might not be necessarily thinking about how this might impact the economic justice index. In fact, I can basically guarantee that they aren't, right? And that's not part of their job. But what can happen now are these conversations around the economic justice index and the action plan that start to open up those doors. And hopefully when the data is being inputted into these various departments, it's being taken in such a way that it might be more useful coming back out. That is kind of the goal of data collection and data sharing across governmental entities. But it is going to take a long time. I would say on the data collection side, there's a lot of gaps. But I also know that SLDC specifically is working through that through hiring of data analysts and people that are in charge of collecting and making those connections. And so I think strides are being made to connect those dots, but it's going to take a while. It really is. And if thinking about not just St. Louis, but other communities as well, things and records that are kept on paper and not in digital format, well, boom, that's strike one right there. Somebody then has to tabulate it. So correcting it from the ground up is going to take a long time, but that's really what needs to happen. That changes the economic justice index into an economic justice scorecard, right? And we talked about that in the plan a little bit, where the index is a snapshot. The scorecard is every year, how are we doing? How are things changing? Are we accomplishing our goals and so forth? And so a key component of that is that data connection between different departments, and not just inside the city, but also the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative we mentioned earlier. There's so much good data there that are being produced by this nonprofit sort of volunteer-based organization that SLDC can tap into. And so it's those connections that really need to be made. And I think many of them are being made.
Yeah, I would say there was a significant gap in capacity at SLDC for data collection. So when we started this process, there wasn't a ton of data at our disposal. And so working through what data did exist, what data we could get from other entities, and then ultimately giving SLDC sort of a how-to guide on when you do have the staff capacity and when you do have the resources and the commitment to this data gathering effort and the updating of the economic justice index and the tracking and all of this, which they've started to do, how can they do it? And so, now SLDC staff is equipped with the ability to update the index or to think about, in a couple of years, did this stuff work? Would we want to add a different data piece? If we did find another data piece that was really helpful and consistent, or something that maybe was a better proxy for what's happening on the ground, could we swap out one of those? And so I think it's an interesting thing for everybody to think about moving forward, is if you came across a piece of data that you feel like is a really good indicator for, neighborhood success or for wealth building or something like that for residents, that it would be an amazing thing if we could generate some sort of regular data source for SLDC to continue to add to this. So I think that's the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, we live in this sort of siloed bureaucratic government system that doesn't necessarily always provide those willingly to each other, and nor is there a clear system for when new data points are found. But I do think this exercise proved the value of pulling those data sources together in something like the index. And so that has sort of started the effort moving forward.
Great. All right, so the last one we have submitted right now it says your example of estimates of what funding would be needed to invest in rehab and new development along MLK was helpful to see. It aligns well with what Partners focused on home repairs for city residents has been doing to estimate the cost of home repairs for older St. Louis City residents, a huge number, but gives a goal. Are those investment estimate scenarios posted somewhere online? I don't remember them in the plan, but could have missed it.
So the table I showed where it was saying that this amount of money is required for each of those categories, and then that bottom right number, which was somewhere around 400 million, that was inclusive of private, basically all funding sources possible, philanthropic, public, private. That's the estimate that's in the plan. Again, that's in 2022 dollars, and probably would increase over time as market conditions change. But that's our estimate. And I like the way you put that it's a funding goal. You know, it's aspirational. It's saying that, okay, well, this is maybe what it's going to take to accomplish this. So we better get started talking to philanthropic funding sources and the creation of the Economic Justice Fund, you know, to help fund some of these projects, and also to partner with private investors. That's going to be a huge portion of the capital stack, and continuing to go for federal grants for infrastructure and state money as well. So it is a funding goal. That's a very good way to put it. Something to work toward.
All right, perfect. Well, I don't see any other questions submitted right now, and we're coming up on our hour and a half, so it's good timing. Again, I'd like to thank Catherine and Adam both for the great presentation and the time that you spent to answer all these questions this afternoon. So this is our looking forward again, our September lunch activity or educational activity will be a joint lunch with the APWA. We haven't done that in a while, but check the newsletter for that as well. If you don't subscribe to our section's newsletter, please do so on our website so you can get more information about all these events. And we have a lot more coming for the rest of the year. We appreciate not only the presenters, but all of the attendees for taking time today to come listen to this great information. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.